Hi, I'm Netta Ulaby. I'm a journalist who covers arts and culture for National Public Radio, and I'm speaking to you right now from Washington, D.C. I have the honor of being here online with Kemp Powers, the writer and the co-director of the Pixar movie Soul. Now, I should add that this is just one of the movies that Kemp Powers brought to us last year. Kemp has a remarkable background as a journalist, a playwright, and an author, but I do think Soul is really going to be the focus of our conversation tonight. And let me just say that I am so bummed out that we are not physically in Seoul, South Korea, to talk about Soul, the movie. Kemp, your film is about a middle-aged man who teaches jazz to students in a public school, and then he dies right before he gets his big break on stage as a musician. And most of the movie is about his struggle to come back from Earth, back to Earth, from a sort of limbo. It's a place where souls live right before and right after their time on Earth. You are someone who has himself lived many lives. What did you think you were going to be when you were a young soul growing up in Brooklyn, New York?
When I was very young, that's a good question. I think the earliest thing that I thought I was going to be as a very young man was a firefighter. That was actually if you had asked me before fifth grade, I would have said firefighter. It was to me like one of the most noble professions, and the New York City Fire Department has a very great reputation. And I've always, as a kid, looked up to firefighters. After fifth grade, when your parents start getting more interested in what you're going to do with yourself, I decided that I was going to become a lawyer. And that dream went out the window the first and last time I did an internship at a law firm in college. I just realized that was not for me. I had no idea that I was going to become a journalist, which is actually my first career that I did for almost 2 decades. But when I first got to college in Washington, D.C., it was actually a teacher who really encouraged me after reading one of my essays to pursue my writing more seriously. And she said that I should go and write for the student newspaper, The Hilltop at Howard University. And I did. I walked over there and said, I think I want to write for the newspaper. They assigned me an article. I did it. I wrote it. It got published, and I had the bug. And then that kind of the rest is history. I really fell in love with journalism, the medium. And I honestly thought that was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I always enjoyed writing, but writing for me was always a hobby. I always wrote creatively. I wrote poems. I wrote short stories. I even wrote comic books, even when I was in college. But it was never something creative writing that I thought I'd be able to make a career out of.
Where for you was the creativity in being a journalist?
Oh man, I mean, to me, journalism I felt like being a journalist was like being paid to learn, because what other profession can you start off as a reporter being given an assignment about a subject you know nothing about, learn enough about it that by the time you've spoken to a bunch of experts, you have a kind of working knowledge about a new subject. I mean, over the course of those 2 decades, I interviewed thousands and thousands of people, and ultimately it's storytelling. It's about telling compelling stories. And in many ways, a lot of the techniques that powered and informed my storytelling as a journalist are the very same techniques I brought into my fictional writing as a playwright and as a screenwriter.
It's funny, you were talking, firefighter, lawyer, journalist, screenwriter. These are all stories. The drama is something that is a thread throughout all of these things. I suppose you're also a dad, and putting out fires is part of what you do as a parent.
Yeah, well, putting out fires is part of what I do in Hollywood too. Trust me. Like, making a movie is really just putting out a gigantic collection of fires. So yeah, being a problem solver and being very good at problem solving and conflict resolution, I think those are skills that will serve you well.
No, I should say, by the way, that we're going to be a little free flowing in the session. Questions from the audience are warmly encouraged and invited. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the screen. So if anyone has any questions for Kemp, please make it clear that you do, and we'll will flow back and forth between the audience and our own Q&A. Given that Soul is so much about music, and I know that you are yourself an enormous music fan, are you also a musician?
I wouldn't call myself a musician anymore, but yes, I was. I played saxophone. I actually played in jazz band going back to high school, in junior high school, and I really stopped playing my instrument while I was in college. But like if you handed me a saxophone now, I could play it still. But I wouldn't call myself a musician. I wouldn't call myself a musician, but I love music. Always have. Music is actually kind of one of the through lines, one of the threads that I inadvertently, I didn't even realize it, has shown up in a lot of my writing. Not just with Soul, but with One Night in Miami. There's a musical through line through the character of Sam Cooke, the project that I'm currently working on. It's just music is a big part of the storytelling process.
Do you listen to music when you work?
Not as much when I do sometimes, but it's just to kind of get me in a relaxed mood to write. When I'm actually writing, music can be a little bit of a distraction. Music is because I listen to it and I become an active listener. The only time I don't really actively listen is when I'm going to bed. I go to sleep to classical music every night. Mm-hmm. There's a classical music station that plays, and that actually helps me rest. But during the day, I listen to all kinds of music to kind of set a mood, and then it goes off when I'm actually ready to kind of get the writing going.
Got it. Now, for the movie Soul, the basic idea of it was not your idea. You were brought in as part of the writing team when the movie was already pretty well underway. How much of the movie had already been made when you joined the Soul team?
Well, it's an iterative process. Making an animated film, you make a different version again and again and again. So your average Pixar movie, we call them reels. That's when you put together a version of the film with 2D storyboards and scratch voice actors, and you show it to an audience, and then you do a brain trust meeting about it. Your average Pixar film has between 7 to 12 brain trust screenings of a film. When I came on board on Soul, which ended up, I think, having 8, it was right before brain trust screen number 3. So it was actually still pretty raw in the development process. The main character was Joe Gardner, but there wasn't really much to him. The reels they showed me were only about 40 minutes long. It wasn't even a movie's worth of a story yet. But there were some set pieces. Joe was there, 22 was there, but the story still needed a lot of development at the writing stage because I was brought on initially as a writer. And it was after about a year of just intense writing on the film that I got promoted to co-director.
Let me go back for a second. How did you even go from being a journalist who's writing for Forbes, and you wrote for GQ, and you wrote for a lot of top American publications? How did you go from that to being a guy who was getting hired by the top animation company in the world to help them make one of their biggest movies?
Well, look, when Pixar called, I was as surprised as anyone else. At the time that they reached out to me, I was far from what one would call having an illustrious career as a screenwriter. The only credit that I had was on season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, a job that I got fired from. I had written on several different TV shows, none of which had actually been made. And I'd sold a pilot to FX that I'd written that didn't get made as well.
Which is normal, I should just say.
Yes,
in Hollywood.
That happens a lot. You spend a lot of time trying and failing. The thing that was a little bit different about me is that I was also writing plays, and my stage plays were getting made. So if you went back 15, 20 years, the pathway to becoming a writer usually started with being an assistant and then getting into a writer's room and maybe writing a spec script, which is a script you're writing for a show that you like. So if you're a big fan of NYPD Blue, you write your idea of an NYPD Blue script. And if someone likes it, that's kind of your door into Hollywood. Just coincidentally, and luckily for me, playwriting became another entry point into Hollywood about 6 or 7 years ago. So instead of having to write a spec script, because of the massive demand for content, people were looking for original voices. And there's no more voicey original writing than a stage play. It's literally just me vomiting up my heart and soul. So when you read one of my plays, you learn so much about me, so much more about me as a writer than you would if I wrote a spec script. So it was actually my plays that started getting interest from film and television studios in Hollywood. In fact, I had asked Pete Docter, the director of Soul and then Pixar's chief creative officer, what of mine had he read that made him want to meet me? And it was my play One Night in Miami. So they read my play and they wanted to bring me out and show it to me. So again, it's the work that I did that was actually the work I was passionate about. And I learned like an important lesson from that, you know, as opposed to all the other things people were telling me I should be writing. It was the stuff that I wrote that I loved that actually finally got me the attention that I wanted to get in the business.
Pixar had never before, in the nearly 24 movies it had made before Soul, featured a main Black character. And of course, there's an incredibly long, despicable history in Hollywood of white people telling stories about the Black experience. And then more recently, the trend was white people still coming up with a story, but then hiring Black writers and consultants to make it more authentic. How far is that from what it felt like when you first got hired by Pixar?
I think that things are evolving and they're evolving rapidly. And a lot of that evolution is being driven by the audience and the demands of the audience. I think that if you go back even 5 or 10 years, your audience would not care about who wrote The Lion King or who directed The Lion King. They just cared about, like, that wasn't a concern for a lot of people. For them, for people, representation literally just meant what you were seeing on the screen. Now, as we've, I think, learned and had conversations over the years about how that representation, just what's on the screen, really isn't moving the needle for anyone in the business, I think people's demands, and because of the internet, people have become very conscious of it. I think you have a sophisticated audience who has certain demands of the creators as well. And I think that's the demand that opened the opportunity. Now, when I say that, that does not mean that I think only Black writers and directors should tell Black stories, or that is not, because the last thing I ever want to do as an artist, ever want to see as an artist, is I don't ever want to be put in a box. You know, again, what was the first TV show I worked on? It was. So for me, it's more about just creating opportunities for, particularly when you enjoy telling the stories of a particular group, to be a part of the storytelling process. And it's evolving. I think the process of making Soul at Pixar was a revolutionary process for Pixar. They did a lot of different things. You know, you mentioned consultants. While Pixar had external consultants for Soul, it was one of the first times they created an internal brain trust of consultants that was literally all the Black employees that worked at Pixar, regardless of their job. So you could be in security, it didn't really matter. And I think that proved so successful that they've now implemented culture trusts for all their films. Even films that aren't, where it's not even about a specific ethnic group, but everyone, even if your director happens to be Asian, you still are going to have an Asian culture trust. So, because one thing that I always said was that I am a Black man, proud Black man. I do not speak for every single Black person. And that's the other shorthand, lazy thing that Hollywood would often do. They hire the one Black representative and say, we covered our bases, because this person, which puts an awful burden on the person you've hired, because you turn to them every time there's a question about Blackness and expect them to have the answer.
Does this sound right? Does this sound right?
Yeah, of course. And I've received that. So I think it's not perfect yet, but it is evolving. And evolution it's messy. Not everyone's going to do it right. You have to. Another thing I encourage people in my business is like to be compassionate and allow people room to stumble and fall. They're not going to do it like you have to. People, if they are afraid that they're going to be eviscerated if they make a mistake, they're not going to try. people have to be allowed to make mistakes and be corrected in order to want to go through that process.
You worked with a dream team of African-American artists and intellectuals when you made Soul. Janetta Coleman, Questlove. I mean, you worked with incredible people. Did you get to pick who you got to work with, or was that external brain trust already in place?
No, we all did. No, we some people. Yeah, it was our feelers went out in every kind of direction. So Dr. Janetta Cole was probably the queen of our consultants. She was not a person who just came in, saw the film, nodded, and walked out the door. She was actually intimately involved every single step of the way the entire time I was there. She would come by and we'd show her character designs. We'd have wonderful discussions. We went to visit her in DC. She was just when we flew to the African American History Museum in Washington DC. She got us a great behind the scenes tour. I mean, she was like the mother of the film in many ways. And yes, whenever you mention an artist who you thought would be a positive contribution to the film, it was amazing how Pixar would reach out. And because of Pixar's incredible reputation, people wanted to be a part of the process. That was really encouraging.
So when you first showed up, you had Pixar had its main character, Joe Gardner, who I understand originally had been imagined as an actor, mm-hmm. and then got turned into a jazz musician before you got hired. A lot of the movie is his interactions with a soul named 22, who's mm-hmm. been resisting coming to Earth and being embodied in human form.
Born. Right.
What did you first see? What was your first role? Did they basically hand you Joe and say, give this guy more personality? How did it work?
No, it wasn't. It was nothing that hyper. I would have actually been bothered if that was the case. It was I was a screenwriter, so there were scenes that we still had to break the story. Breaking the story means we still didn't know how it ended. We didn't have much of a third act. The reels that they showed me, there were cue cards saying, and then something interesting happens at this part. There was a lot of the story that needed to be figured out from a plotting standpoint. So we were having almost daily meetings. Myself, there was another writer on board when I first came on, Mike Jones, Pete, Doctor, the head of story, the editor. We would have hours of story discussions every day, and it was breaking story. And then I would go into and either write original or rewrite existing scenes. Animated films are shot and produced out of sequence order. So you're not working from a straight script. Screenwriting is usually a very lonely profession. Writing a Pixar movie is a group effort. So as opposed to me walking away and coming back 12 weeks later with a completed script or a revised script 8 weeks later, with Pixar, the entire film is broken down into 30 to 50 component scenes that we call sequences. And so there are sequences that are kind of that need to go into certain levels of production. So it'll be on any given day, it could be I'll be writing or rewriting sequence 3, sequence 12, and sequence 17. and that'll be my day. I'll go into each one of those sequences and write them. And I don't know if what I did works until we put them all together in a reel. So it was just intense writing. Of course, I had a mind of Joe specifically, but that was also in service. It was always in service of the story that we were trying to tell. So that was it wasn't come in and here, make Joe feel blacker. That was never the case. It was always in service of the story we were trying to tell.
What you're describing, and maybe this is too obvious and cliched a metaphor, but it sounds like jazz. There's your saxophone, and you put it together with the bass, and you put it together with the drums, and
that's what it felt like making it. It really felt like you had to be great at kind of freestyling, and a lot of times you weren't certain if the things that you were doing were going to make sense. So it was a transformative process to even make a film of this type, of this scale.
Will you tell that story about Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock?
Oh, you mean the story about, yeah, that was actually one of the stories that inspired Pete to make Joe a jazz musician. There was a Masters series that Herbie Hancock, he watched on Herbie Hancock, where he was talking about how he was playing a concert with Miles Davis. And in the middle of the concert, Herbie said that he just played an awful note. He just played it completely wrong. And he was like, oh my God, this was a great performance. This was a great show. And I just reduced it to rubble. But he said Miles just heard the note, played a few notes of his own, and made his mistake correct. And afterwards, Herbie said he spoke to Miles and said, how did you do that? And Miles basically told him that Herbie had judged what he'd done as wrong. Miles simply accepted it and turned it into something beautiful. And that was kind of like the perfect metaphor for the film that we were trying to make. Like that was really kind of the moral of the whole story, is that 22 wanted certain guarantees in order to go and live life, but the reality is none of us can control what life is going to throw at us. All we can really do is accept what we're given and turn it into something of value, just like jazz. So that became kind of like our North Star. That and of course we brought on Herbie as a consultant, so he was also a part of the creative process on the film as well.
What did he bring to it? What's an example besides just his amazing?
There's a lot of there's jazz playing in the film, and we wanted to make sure that the way we characterized the relationships that Joe had with other musicians, the way we wanted to make sure all of that was as authentic as humanly possible. And there was no better way to do that than to fill a room full of jazz musicians. I mean, even like John Batiste, who was who created all the jazz music in the film. We brought him on originally just to play Joe's music, but very quickly, and that was the case with a lot of people, they wanted to become more involved, and John began to contribute, and like we would bounce ideas off of him. Talking about a great concept was the one about Joe's suit. And needing to have a nice suit. That seems like a minor detail. It's actually a big detail, because I remember John saying, when we asked him, what makes a person a success or a failure? And he was one of the first people who said, it's not just about talent. Talent is just one component of it. Because one thing we struggled with early on with Joe was this idea that if he was so talented, how come he hadn't already been successful as a jazz musician? And that caused a lot of people to bump and say, this doesn't make any sense. If he's this transcendent talent, people, once he plays his music, people would see and appreciate that. And John Batiste was like, oh no, I've known plenty of people who are super duper talented who fail and don't work and don't have a career. And when we asked, well, what is it about? He's like, it's about any number of things. Something as simple as they're wearing the wrong clothes, to they have the wrong personality, to they're playing the wrong kind of music. That is a million different things. In fact, having success is almost like a miracle when it does happen, because it has to be a combination of all these factors, some of which are out of your control, but others that are within your control in order to be successful as an artist, as a musician.
When you're working at Pixar, I imagine it's like you're playing with a bunch of Miles Davises and Herbie Hancocks.
Sure. Go ahead.
Were there moments when you heard a wrong note being played and the geniuses saying, here's how we make it beautiful?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most challenging things early on is getting over the potential to be intimidated, because everyone's very well knows a lot about the brain trust process at Pixar, where you have a group of your peers who are giving you notes on the reels that you just showed them, and deciding which of those notes to accept or not is really difficult when everyone around that table has Academy Awards. You know what I mean? Like, you're being given notes by people who are considered the most gifted storytellers, in the world. And there's 30 of them in the room. And in many cases, you disagree. with them. And it's about having the fortitude to just kind of believe in what you're pushing back on and being able to live with that. Because ultimately, what I found about the brain trust, people think the brain trust is something where everyone gets together and kind of like tweaks your film and turns it into quote unquote a Pixar film. The reality of the brain trust, everyone's just trying to help you execute your idea better. And every person in that group, if given the same subject matter, would make a different film. So it was always kind of coming back to what was the film that Pete wanted to make, and secondarily also me, like what were we trying to accomplish, and which of those ideas could kind of help us on that journey. And sometimes there would be suggestions you'd get where you go like, I don't think that really works for us, and someone would say, just maybe give it a try, and you do, and you're like, oh man, that's great, because you're so close to certain things. It's really hard. There's that expression, killing your babies, you know, and that's always a part of the process. Ideas that you're really passionate about, things that a great joke, a beautiful moment, and you want to, there's no way you want to cut that out of the movie, but you realize it's what's holding you back. You realize it doesn't serve the overall narrative. You realize that it's actually part of what's muddling things. So often the realization of those things came from it being pointed out by other, you know, as you put them, Miles Davises in the room.
Speaking of rooms, I can't see who's in this one. I've been trying to figure out if there's anyone asking questions, and I can't see the screen, unfortunately. So I'm going to ask the moderators who are in the room to assist. Is there anyone who has a question for Mr. Powers?
I see someone with a mic.
Hello, and I really loved your movie, and in the movie, 22 keeps looking for her spark, and just like 22, there are many young people who haven't found what they really want to do for like the rest of their lives. So do you have any advice for these young people?
My advice would be that what they're feeling is absolutely normal. It's that, first, we live in an era where what you want to do with the rest of your life, you're allowed to change your mind as much as you want. Yeah, what I wanted to do 5 years ago is not what I'm doing right now. And what I'm doing right now, I'd be happy to do it for the rest of my life. So I think uncertainty, I think we've unfortunately given young people this idea that you become an adult and then all of a sudden you have things figured out, everything figured out. The reality is every adult I know hasn't figured it all out either. We're all full of doubt. We're all full of questions, self-doubt. We all suffer from a certain amount of imposter syndrome. And that's actually normal. That's actually normal. And I think people should not be afraid of trying things, particularly trying new things, and not be afraid to fail. Because again, the key to any success that I've had has been a great deal of failure first.
Oh, thank you so much.
Sure.
Do we have other questions from the audience?
Hello, Mr. Ken Powers. Thanks so much for being here today, and I really appreciate all your talk regarding the hardships that you explained today during the speech. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask was kind of related to the previous question that the lady asked in advance regarding failures, and how do you especially encourage the youngsters, the people in their 20s and 30s, especially the ones that are going on a different path compared to the traditional path in careers. How would you encourage them to continue even though they face a lot of failures and hardships, especially when people around you don't really accept the work, if they don't really accept the work that you do as legitimate? Because, for example, because I write for a living and trying to become a novelist, but there's still a lot of gateways that I have to overcome, especially being an Asian American and trying to write in English. where the gatekeepers in the publishing field are majority Caucasian white males. So how would you really, it can be specific for me, but for other people who are also trying to go in this creative path, how would you encourage them to continue even despite all the failures of the hardships that they face? How would you give them the courage? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It's interesting because whenever someone asks me what I do, and I say that I'm a writer, I can't tell you how many people say, "Oh, sure, I am too. I write too," and in an almost dismissive way, as though what I do is something that you could train a dog to do. There's a certain idea that like what I do is not a craft, it's not a skill. And as you probably know, there's nothing further from the truth. I had to weather a lot of that, my career goals being something that people didn't really take very seriously. Regarding what you're dealing with specifically, you mentioned some of the specific challenges that you face, being Asian American, having to write in English and stuff. And I think that for me, I believe that the thing that you might view as a weakness could actually be your strength as a writer. Because I tell people, I don't believe in $1 million ideas. I believe in $1 million execution. And when I say that, what I'm saying is the thing that makes the thing that makes me a good writer, an interesting writer, is me. It's the collection of my life experiences. And I figure out a way to get some of those very specific things that I've experienced, that I've witnessed in my life into my writing. And that's something that I think anyone can do. It's about having that distinct voice. And I think people are always open to hearing some kind of new perspective, some kind of new idea when it's an idea that's well executed and well told. So again, we when I got into the Writers Guild of America, the Writers Guild of America, for those who don't know, is the union that represents screenwriters in Hollywood. When you first get in, we have an orientation meeting, and they sit everyone down and they say, "Welcome to the Writers Guild of America. Statistically speaking, it's as difficult to become a member of this guild as it is to become a Major League Baseball player." Now, when they say that, it really dawned on me. If I went out, I speak a lot to students. If I went out and spoke to kids at a school and asked them, what do they want to be when they grow up? And one of them said a professional athlete, what will we tell that kid? You better come up with a backup plan. So just by deciding that you want to be a writer, you have to understand that to all the people around you, the people who can sometimes be a little negative, what you're trying to do is almost as impossible or difficult as being a pro athlete. But there's still a lot of pro athletes out there, and there's still a lot of writers, and there's no reason why it can't be you, but you just have to acknowledge the uphill climb that you face. And it is one of the most difficult things to do in the world. That's why I said the thing that makes you you and that you're passionate about, you're going to have to, that's the only thing that's going to carry you to the finish line.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have definitely time for another few questions from the audience.
Okay, I want to ask one question. Yeah, it is about respecting creativity when it comes to in a group. You said Pixar is one group with you and other writers, and they have each creativity when it comes to one goal, even though it is one goal. So there should be some conflicts when you and other people write for one film. So what's your own way to respect all the creativities in one groups, even though they are all different, or they make some conflict?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, conflict is a part of the process. I think that's why the ground rules that have been established with the Brain Trust are that you're not supposed to take anything that's said inside that room personally. And everyone is supposed to be completely honest and completely forthcoming. Now, saying all that, have there been meetings where people can get into arguments that border on shouting matches? Absolutely, absolutely. But you know what? A little bit of conflict isn't a bad thing. Great work, great success, great art comes out of the combustible nature of the creative process. And when people disagree, it's usually because they are incredibly passionate about their idea, their thoughts. And I just feel like all you really have to do is make sure that you listen to and hear the other person out. I'm one of my, I'd say, skills as a journalist that's really served me well in my new environment is that I'm a very active listener. It's very easy for me to listen to someone talk for hours and understand what they're saying and parse what they're saying and come up with follow-up questions, all the things I had to do as a reporter. And when you're in this kind of environment where people are disagreeing and you have a certain amount of conflict, I'm never the person who's going to just be trying to shout someone's ideas down. I've heard their ideas out. You have to thoughtfully consider it. And if there's something you don't like, this is probably the biggest advice I give to people when it comes to giving notes. If there's something you don't like, unless you can offer an alternative, a way to fix it, something else you'd rather see instead, keep that to yourself. Because no one ever wants to hear that you just don't like something, you don't know why, but you just hate it, the end. Offer up the things that you don't like with a solution to show the person that you're trying to help them solve the problem. And then I think no matter how heated these disagreements can be, no one walks away taking it personally or with their feelings hurt.
It reminds me a little bit of the story you told, Kemp, about Miles Davis listening to the note that a fellow musician played poorly. And instead of just being like, ugh, this whole thing's a disaster, the song's ruined, you're an idiot, he took that note and he found what worked, and the song just went in a different direction.
Yeah.
And that's genius. You know, that's creativity.
Absolutely.
I can't thank you enough for sharing your genius and your creativity and the hard work and the resilience and the struggle that of your journey that you've shared with us. Is there anything, Kemp, that I haven't asked you or that folks in the audience haven't asked you that you want to leave us with before we say goodbye?
Only that, you know, that it's really important when you're pursuing your passions to not worry as much about what the market is asking for, because this whole thing is cyclical. You know, that the people don't know what they want half the time until they see it. So much of the work that has really gained traction for me is writing that there really wasn't a market for that writing. It wasn't something that anyone was asking for, but they were just stories and ideas that I was very passionate about. And kind of chasing those down almost with tunnel vision, regardless of what the world is saying it wants to see, can really bear some fruit. At the very least, you'll have work at the end of the day that you can point at and be very proud of.
Well, on behalf of the World Knowledge Forum, thank you again for being so generous with your time, and thank you so much for the audience for your wonderful questions. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.